It had been 22 years since America had hosted its first World's Fair in New York City's Crystal Palace during the years 1853 and 1854. The construction of that wrought iron and glass palace had been directly inspired by the Crystal Palace created to house the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, hosted by England in Hyde Park in London in 1851, which was later recognized as the very first World's Fair ever. It wasn't long after America's first World's Fair when businessmen, industrialists, politicians, and investors began champing at the bit to host another such fair to bring world attention once more to the increasing accomplishments of the growing young United States. Unfortunately, all plans for another such fair had to be put on the back burner when only 7 years after the New York Fair ended, the country tumbled into chaos with the outbreak of the Civil War. But almost immediately after the Civil War came to an end, pressure for the country to arrange another international fair started building up again, and the promoters knew just how to sell the idea. It wouldn't be just an industrial fair for general purposes. It would be carefully planned to fall in the year 1876 and would be part of a national Centennial celebration honoring the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, America's birthday party. It was to be called the International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of the Soil and Mine. And after a period of minor debate, it became obvious that the only logical place to host it would be where it all started, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, home to Independence Hall, where the signing occurred. In 1871, the U.S. Congress officially authorized the Centennial and set up the United States Centennial Commission to oversee planning and implementation of the celebration. Commissioners included one representative from each state and territory in the United States. The U.S. government would have general oversight of the plans, but would not contribute any funding, as the organizers were certain that the whole thing could be handled by private enterprise. Congress authorized the commission to sell stock in the enterprise. Other funding came from large donations by the city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania. There was to be none of the old-fashioned method of holding this fair in a single building, as had been done in London and New York City for previous World's Fairs. The commission had far grander plans than that. The city of Philadelphia set aside 285 acres of its Fairmount Park for use for the Centennial, and plans were developed to set up a whole temporary town of more than 200 buildings on the land. 38 foreign countries contributed displays to the exhibition. 15 had their own exhibition buildings, as did 26 of the 37 United States. Although some of the state and country buildings included extensive displays of their goods and resources, others mainly contained administrative offices and perhaps a gathering area for visitors from that state or country to socialize. And the states and countries each had other displays scattered throughout the fair buildings related to specific topics such as art and horticulture. There were at least 4 main purposes for the celebration. First was to emphasize the pride of the country in its accomplishments since the founding of the nation, and thereby foster feelings of enthusiastic patriotism among the citizens of the country. Second was to give other nations an opportunity to examine the fruits of American enterprise and to give American enterprises an opportunity to measure themselves against what the rest of the world had to offer. Third was to emphasize and foster feelings of brotherhood across the regions in the nation to counter the lingering regional animosities left over from the Civil War. By encouraging these southern states to participate with northern states on an equal footing in a national exhibition, it was hoped that their resentments would be helped to fade away. And the fourth main purpose was to provide an opportunity for a respite for the attendees from the troubles of the country, a chance to be refreshed and uplifted and entertained. The fair was scheduled to run from May 10th to November 10th, 1876. Building the Centennial town got underway in 1874. There were to be 5 main buildings commissioned and paid for by the Centennial Commission, around which everything else was clustered. The largest building, and the centerpiece of architectural impressiveness, was dubbed the Main Exhibition Building. It's difficult to assume that its architects didn't have some desire to top the London Crystal Palace of 1851 in size. The Philadelphia building was very close to the dimensions of the Crystal Palace, but enough larger to break the record. The Crystal Palace had been 1,851 feet long by 456 feet deep, for a total of 770,000 square feet, covering about 18 acres. The Centennial Main Exhibition Building was 1,880 feet long by 464 feet deep, for a total of 872,000 square feet, covering 20 acres. It was, at the time, the largest building by area in the world, and it had been erected in much less time than one might expect because, like the London building, it was also made up of prefabricated sections which were quickly assembled on site. Displays in the machinery hall allowed businesses to actively demonstrate processes of manufacturing while also offering their products for sale, playing into the growing conspicuous consumption habits of many visitors that had resulted from the continuing Industrial Revolution. Agricultural Hall was where all the visiting farmers and agriculturalists could watch demonstrations of the latest inventions and improvements in farm equipment. Nearby was 42 acres of farm and livestock exhibits. To see beautiful displays of fruit, vegetable, flower, and landscape plants, you'd visit the Horticultural Hall. Its beautiful Victorian gardens made it a place both to explore a wide variety of plants from around the world and a place to escape the heat and hubbub of the rest of the fairgrounds for a while. If you wanted to see a large collection of fine arts from around the U.S. and around the world, you visited Memorial Hall. So many artworks were submitted to the exhibition that an annex building had to be built behind the hall to hold them all. The field of photography had made big strides by 1876, since the time an early collection of Matthew Brady's daguerreotypes won acclaim at the 1851 Crystal Palace Great Exhibition in London. But photography was still not given status as legitimate art by the organizers of the Centennial Fair. Instead of including photographs in the displays at Memorial Hall, they created a whole separate building to house photographic submissions. As mentioned, many states and some foreign countries constructed their own buildings. The buildings for countries were scattered throughout the fairgrounds. Those for the states were mostly along States Avenue. Mississippi and Canada both had log cabins. The buildings for Arkansas and Brazil resembled each other a bit. England and Indiana were more imposing than some, such as Maryland. There was a French sit-down restaurant and a Tunisian outdoor cafe and bazaar. The Fair Commission itself was responsible for the construction of several smaller buildings, including fire and police stations, a medical department, and 7 public comfort stations, which hopefully by then featured the latest in flush toilets. The remainder of the buildings represented several interests. The United States government had 7 structures, with its main exhibit hall housing such variety as a display of memorabilia related to George Washington and a large collection of Native American items from the Smithsonian collection. 40 more buildings were either commercial enterprises like the Singer Sewing Machine Company or community service groups like the American Bible Society. Similar to what happened in New York at the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1853, outside the main gate of the Centennial exhibition, row upon row of flimsy wooden structures sprang up to create a shabby business district, practically overnight, a mile in each direction. They housed everything from the Victorian version of Hotel Sixes, greasy spoon restaurants, ice cream shops, beer gardens, and shows such as those with can-can dancers. These were sandwiched 2 or 3 deep on narrow lots. A brand new but temporary passenger rail station was erected by the Pennsylvania Railroad right across from the main gate for train trips from far away and nearby right from downtown Philadelphia. Although the railroad did construct some new passenger cars to meet the anticipated increase in travelers, they seriously underestimated how great the demand would be. So they eventually resorted to retrofitting freight cars to hold passengers to meet the need. They were referred to as peach cars, I would assume because they normally transported peaches. Trolleys pulled right up to the main gate for area transportation also. And the West End Railway, a miniature train, provided transportation inside the sprawling fairgrounds to give weary feet a break. A number of official and unofficial guidebooks were offered for sale at the fair and nearby, giving suggestions for 1 to 14-day itineraries for seeing the fair. There were rolling chairs for rent at public comfort stations. You could hire a chair with an attendant to push you for 60 cents an hour or $4.50 a day, or get one for a friend or a family member to push you around in for $1 for 3 hours. There was an internal telegraph system for wealthy visitors who wanted to arrange to have their carriages waiting for them as they exited the grounds at the end of the day. Visitors could find lodging in nearby Philadelphia for the duration of their stay, but some relatively substantial and respectable but temporary hotels were built right across or down the street from the fairgrounds to meet the needs of fairgoers who preferred staying nearby. The Transcontinental Hotel stood opposite the main entrance to the exposition with 500 rooms. The Globe Hotel, just around the corner, had 5 stories, could room 3,500 people, and fed 30,000 meals a day to guests. Costs for these and other hotels of equal quality ran usually from $2.50 to $5 a night, including meals. The Atlas Hotel complex, just a bit down the street, charged just $1 a day for its 1,500 rooms and served meals starting at 25 cents. Visitors could dine at any of 9 restaurants on the fairgrounds, including the Great American Restaurant and the Restaurant of the South, as well as a German restaurant, 2 French restaurants, and more. For quick snacks, there were stands selling popcorn, a relatively new novelty, as well as waffles, soda water, root beer, and other snacks. For a cold liquid refreshment during the hot summer days of the fair, your best bet was to visit one of the dozen or so Arctic soda fountains available in or just outside the fairgrounds. These huge, ornate marble structures with machinery inside that created carbonated water and many silver spigots on the outside that dispensed a wide variety of flavors to add to your plain soda featured internal holding tanks with blocks of ice to keep that water ice cold. The largest Arctic soda fountain was inside a special small building that was right across from the main entrance to the fair next to the Globe Hotel. Inside the building was a 33-foot, 30-ton tower made of variegated marble trimmed with silver and decorated with ornate chandeliers. Supposedly the largest soda fountain in the world, it was outfitted with 104 spigots that dispensed syrup, mineral water, and soda water. If you wanted a more robust beverage, you could also find Bock beer sold at the fairgrounds. And if you wanted an ice-cold drink without having to pay even a penny, you could stop by the Temperance Fountain, built by the Sons of Temperance. The gazebo-like structure surrounded a fountain that dispensed water that flowed over blocks of ice to keep it cold. The fair offered fireworks displays on occasion and frequent entertainment by musical groups from symphony orchestras to minstrel bands. There were special days sponsored by states and nearby businesses, which might include events like hot air balloon ascensions. At the back edge of the fairgrounds was the Sawyer Observatory Tower, at 300 feet, the tallest structure in the United States at the time. 2 glassed-in steam elevators allowed customers to ride to the top for a fantastic view of the fairgrounds, Philadelphia, and the surrounding countryside. It was an extremely popular attraction at the fair, and afterwards was disassembled and moved to Coney Island in New York. Admission to the Centennial was 50 cents. A guidebook cost 25 cents, a glass of soda water 10 cents, a ride on the West End Railway 5 cents. As one writer put it, the average daily salary of an American worker in 1876 was $1.21. For most Americans, working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day with no paid vacation, a visit to the Centennial, which was not open at night or on Sunday, would have been a special event indeed. The organizers of the fair decided they wanted it to be a really classy affair, so they decided they needed an official Centennial March for the exhibition, written by some famous composer. They settled on one of the most famous in the world at the time, German composer Richard Wagner. Even if you aren't much into classical music, you will recognize who he was when I remind you of the Wedding March, played for most weddings in the U.S. and in many areas around the world for the past 150 years. It was composed by him for a wedding scene in his opera titled Lohengrin, which premiered in 1850. And even if you've never had the slightest interest in operas, you may well remember another Wagner piece written in 1862 titled The Ride of the Valkyries, which was part of a major set of operas that he wrote based on Norse mythology. Millions are familiar with that piece because it was the background music to the dramatic car chase scene in the Blues Brothers movie, where Artie Johnson, as an American Nazi agitator, and his driver fly through the sky in their red car, while the Bluesmobile, with Jake and Elwood inside, does backflips nearby in the sky. With a reputation for such stirring music, the fair organizers were willing to pay Wagner $5,000, the equivalent of about $120,000 in modern money, to provide an equally stirring march for their fair. Unfortunately, everyone, including Wagner himself, was underwhelmed by the basically boring musical score he came up with. It was played at the fair, but has seldom ever been heard again, unlike most of what Wagner created back then. He was said to have commented later when admitting how mediocre it was that the best thing about the thing was the $5,000 I was paid. But it was easy to ignore that little fiasco when May 10, 1876 arrived. A crowd of 10,000 gathered in front of Memorial Hall for the opening ceremony, most of them carrying umbrellas as it was pouring down rain for a while. President Ulysses S. Grant led the ceremonies and then declared the exhibition opened, and by the end of the day, over 180,000 people had been the first to experience all that the fair had to offer. After Grant had finished his part in the ceremonies, he and his party entered Memorial Hall to look around. Here he is walking through a reception line for the representatives of the foreign nations exhibiting at the fair. Behind Grant in the line, you can see a man with a long beard. That is Dom Pedro, Emperor of Brazil, an honored guest in America, the first world leader to visit the country since its founding. The emperor had an international reputation as an exceptionally kind and great leader, and Americans greeted him with enthusiasm wherever he went in the country during his visit in 1876, including at the Centennial. In fact, President Grant, who was in the last months of the final year of his presidency, had fallen out of favor with most Americans because of scandals in his administration. So the reception of the crowd to Dom Pedro, wherever he went at the Centennial, was perceived by many to be much more enthusiastic than that toward Grant. Now that we've passed the inaugural day of the exhibition, it's time to do some exploring inside the buildings. The main building included exhibits on education and science, but concentrated largely on the industrial arts and on businesses which wished to display advertise, and some of them sell their merchandise. Such direct sales were not allowed at the Crystal Palace in London and at the Crystal Palace in New York. But by 1876, the Consumer Society, brought to life by the increased production and lower prices of the Industrial Revolution, was well underway. People expected to be able to enjoy shopping as part of their entertainment. Machinery Hall was the place to go if you enjoyed examining machines of all sizes and types and watching industry at work. For instance, you could see the imposing military power of the guns and missiles displayed by Krupp, the famous German munitions manufacturer, such as this 20.5-foot monster cannon that weighed 81 tons. Or you could watch the functioning of this much larger but far less intimidating printing press that churned out rolls of wallpaper. There were steam engines to pull trains, and the gigantic Corliss engine, perhaps the most popular attraction at the fair. It was also the source of most of the power at the fair to run the other machines. Poet Walt Whitman, who had attended the 1853 Crystal Palace Fair in New York and was thrilled by it, was back for this fair too. And this time around, what enraptured him the most was evidently the Corliss engine. A friend who had come along with Walt to the fair later described that he sat looking at this colossal and mighty piece of machinery for half an hour in silence, contemplating the ponderous motions of the greatest machinery man has built. Exhibits in the Agriculture Building covered a wider variety of topics than you might expect. It did include items related to regular family farming, such as simple farm implements like hoes, and complex machinery like McCormick reapers, and windmills for such purposes as pumping water for livestock. But it wasn't just for farm items at all. It was the place to find anything having to do with agriculture and forest products, fruit trees and food and drink made from fruit, such as wine, land and marine animals, textiles from animal or vegetable sources, and much more. Most important of all, it is where you went to see the machinery used to manufacture chocolates, and to find the products made by that machinery by such manufacturers as Stephen F. Whitman and Son of Philadelphia. Stephen started a small confectionery and fruit shop near the waterfront in Philadelphia in 1842 when he was only 19, catering to traveling sailors and their wives. They would bring imported fruits, nuts, and cocoa, which were gathered during their voyages, to Whitman so he could make the popular European-style confections Americans craved in that era. By 1854, the company was the first to package candy in printed, marked boxes, a package everyone recognizes today. The beautiful Horticultural Hall was more like the Crystal Palaces in London and New York, made of glass and iron, along with colored brick. It had blue marble entrance steps and a reflecting pool outside. A long sunken garden featuring 1,000 different colors of flowers, called Fountain Avenue, ran all the way from the front of the hall to the Temperance Fountain. Horticultural exhibits inside and out included ornamental trees, shrubs, and flowers, hothouses, garden tools, and outdoor furniture. There were orange and lemon trees bearing fruit, an India rubber tree, and palms. Memorial Hall, also known as the Art Gallery, was where you hung out if you were particularly interested in statuary and in paintings. The Photograph Exhibition Building, immediately next to Memorial Hall, was where you went to examine the latest in the new methods of photography. It had a glass roof so the lighting would be optimum for viewing the photos. Now that we've taken an introductory peek at the inside of all the 5 big main buildings, let's just wander around randomly and spot some more of the wide variety of displays the fair had to offer. Sculpture would be particularly found in the art building. Statues of young children were a popular subject with the Victorian crowds. Sentimental statues of children being children, looking cute, looking whiny, being friendly, teasing one another like this little boy teasing a little girl by keeping away from her an enticing bubble-blowing toy. If you remember the introduction of the scandalously fully nude Greek slave statue at the London and New York Crystal Palace fairs, and the initial discomfort of American audiences to the idea of staring at naked ladies, you may wonder how the crowds were doing with such topics 20 years later. Turns out the discomfort had worn off. Naked was in with the crowds of 1876 at the Centennial. First with babies, usually Cupid statues, which were like little naked baby angels with wings. And then partially naked ladies with naked baby Cupids. And then fully naked ladies with naked baby Cupids. And then fully naked ladies playing kissy face with full-grown angels. What you most expected to see at early World's Fairs in the 19th century was the latest unique and new inventions. Here are a few from the Centennial exhibition. The first is the most significant. Young 29-year-old Alexander Graham Bell, whose name wasn't famous yet, had just finished inventing his first telephone and was nagged by a friend to send it to the fair to be displayed, which he did. But he was teaching at a Boston school for teachers of the deaf at the time. It was at the end of the school year, and he was busy with final classes for the term and administering and grading final exams. so he didn't bother to go to the exhibition himself. The telephone receiver and mouthpiece on display got almost no attention from visitors, as there was no actual demonstration of how it worked. As one writer put it later, it attracted less notice than the packages of magic tricks on sale nearby. Even if Bell had been there, the machinery hall with all the machines in motion was far too noisy for primitive voice transmission to be heard. The fair was closed to the public on Sundays, and Machinery Hall fell silent for the day. So Sunday, June 25th, was set aside for the judges to look at all inventions that required a quiet environment to work. Bell decided he could take that one day off from his teaching responsibilities, so traveled from Boston to the fairgrounds to demonstrate his invention. The team of judges that included Emperor Dom Pedro, as well as the famous British scientist Lord Kelvin, was almost worn out by the time they got to Bell's exhibit, so decided to skip it until another day. But Bell was not planning on returning. This was his only chance to demonstrate his telephone. As luck would have it, suddenly Emperor Dom Pedro stepped up and greeted him. Turns out they had met earlier in the year when the emperor had visited Boston. Bell had escorted him for a visit to the city's school for the deaf. Dom Pedro engaged him in conversation and asked him to show how this telephone gadget worked. So Bell handed the receiver to Dom Pedro, told him to wait there with the rest of the judges, and then went off to a room elsewhere in the building with the mouthpiece. From a distant room, Alexander spoke into the mouthpiece, reciting "to be or not to be," as seen in this still shot from a 1910 silent film about Bell, with a movie actor playing him. Dom Pedro wasn't even sure what to expect, but casually put the receiver up to his ear. It was later reported to Bell that Dom Pedro was said to have then suddenly gasped out loud in astonishment, "My God, it speaks!" He dropped it like a hot potato, and Lord Kelvin picked it up and also heard, at which point the whole group of judges went storming down the hallway to find Bell. And the rest is history. Another significant invention on display at the fair was the Grant Difference Engine, an early precursor to the modern computer. Its primary purpose was to calculate and print out mathematical tables of all kinds, such as tables of logarithms or square roots. It was said to calculate 10 to 12 terms per minute when hand-cranked, and to compute more than double that amount when power-driven. Then there was the printing telegraph. As you will note, it looks a bit like an old treadle sewing machine. That's because the pedals were from a sewing machine. It didn't need a battery to run. You pumped on the treadle to create the electricity needed via a process involving a large magnet. The piano-like keyboard with 26 keys created electrical Morse code signals for each letter you wanted to send in a message, and at the same time sent a signal to a gadget that imprinted the letter on a strip of paper on a spool. Remington's first typewriter was displayed at the fair. It typed only capital letters and was the first to use the QWERTY keyboard layout. This picture is not of an item on display at the fair. It is an old-fashioned kind of iron from much earlier. The word sad in this case is an Old English word meaning solid. From the 17th century on, women ironed clothes with these thick slabs of cast iron, triangular and with a handle, heated in a fire or on a stove. They were also called flat irons. Since they were all out of iron, the handles got very, very hot, and the housewife had to use a cloth to hold them, which was awkward. But Florence Potts had a better idea. She invented the cold handle sad iron and introduced it to the wider public in a display at the fair. The single wooden handle was removable and sold as a set with 3 irons. It was a very popular display with the ladies because you could get adorable little tiny versions of the iron as a souvenir, which had a teensy little removable handle. Another very practical item on display was the portable bathtub, an item made of rubberized cloth that folded up to become a suitcase. It was invented by Ethelbert Watts, a fastidious young man who was frustrated that so many hotels and other places to stay on trips did not have bathtubs yet. It's not quite clear from records of the fair how you filled it up with water when you got there, but perhaps Ethelbert had that all worked out too. By the way, Ethelbert was the great-grandfather of Downton Abbey actress Elizabeth McGovern. This lovely sculptured bas-relief bust of a sleeping young woman displayed at the fair was not to be found in Memorial Hall with the other elegant marble statues that look similar. That's because it wasn't made out of marble. It was sculpted out of butter by this very gifted farmer's wife from Arkansas, Carolyn Brooks, who was famous for her unusual talent. In 1867, she had created her first butter sculpture when, after the failure of the family farm's cotton crop, she sought a source of supplemental income. Here's a full-length butter sculpture of a sleeping young woman she did 2 years later, which she shipped to France, preserved by ice, to be exhibited at the Third Paris World's Fair in 1878. She later studied art in Paris and Florence, working in marble, although she never lost her touch with butter, too. She can be seen in photos from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where she exhibited a life-sized bas-relief butter bust of Columbus, as well as 4 marble statues in the Fine Arts Building at that fair. In addition to buttery fine art and unusual inventions, the fair also featured plenty of not very exciting displays of everyday items. Oh, and over at the Machinery Hall, the National Suspender Company of New York had a display where you could order custom suspenders with your very own name woven into the straps, and watch the machine while it manufactured your suspenders. And last but not least, you could visit a very unusual exhibit consisting of just one item, a really big sculpture of a hand holding a torch. Yes, that is Lady Liberty's forearm clutching the torch she was later to raise high in New York Harbor. As you may know, the Statue of Liberty was created in France as a gift from the people of France to the people of the United States. The French were to raise the money for the creation of the statue, and the Americans were to raise the money to pay for the base on which it was to stand. Work had just begun in France on the gigantic project in 1875, and the architect chose to make the arm and hand first, so that it could be brought on a public relations mission in 1876 to the U.S. in order to begin raising the necessary funds. It was constructed first in Paris, then taken apart like a jigsaw puzzle, shipped to the U.S. in pieces, then put back together on the Centennial exhibition grounds. Visitors could pay an admission fee to climb up an internal stairway to the top of the torch from which they could view the fairgrounds. So now we've completed our whirlwind tour of the highlights of the Philadelphia Centennial exhibition as they would have been experienced by the Victorian visitors who flocked there in 1876. But we aren't done yet. As mentioned in Episode 2 of this World's Fairs Exposed series, each World's Fair had a public face that was carefully crafted by the sponsors to give an almost fairy tale illusion of perfection and magic that had gone into its presentation. Just like the Emerald City of Oz looked when Dorothy and her friends first arrived there. But each World's Fair also had another side, just as the Emerald City and its creator, the Wizard of Oz, had another side. The side behind the curtain. So let's pull back that curtain in 1876 and poke around to see just a bit of what was behind the illusion. We'll start with this lady. This is Elizabeth Duane Gillespie, great-granddaughter of Ben Franklin, who was head of the Women's Centennial Executive Committee. The very enthusiastic and efficient Women's Committee had been responsible for organizing the raising of more than $2 million from across America in 1875 that went directly to the expenses of the exhibition, and had been promised in return to have a section of the main exhibition building set aside as a place to display the works of women that had contributed to the 100 years of America's growth. Imagine their surprise and disappointment when they were informed late in 1875 by the all-male Centennial Board that actually there wouldn't be enough room for them in that main building because too many foreign nations were clamoring for space. If the little ladies wanted to display women's work, they'd have to raise more funds and build their own building. Although no doubt temporarily discouraged, they stiffened their resolve and swiftly went out and raised more money, enough to pay for the erection of a women's pavilion building. Although the architect of this building was a male, everything displayed there, including 80 inventions, were created by women, including the so-called Baxter steam engine, created by engineer Emma Allison, which was installed in a small brick addition to the building and was used to power all the building's machines. That included a printing press that published pamphlets and a weekly newspaper titled The New Century for Women. The Women's Pavilion Building was located directly across the street from the U.S. Government Building. Historical records note teasingly that there were cannons on the lawn of the Government Building pointing directly across at the Women's Pavilion. But you might say that they got the last laugh on the all-male Centennial Board. On July 4th, 150,000 people attended an Independence Day extravaganza related to the fair but held in nearby Philadelphia next to Independence Hall. The day was highlighted by male speakers, brass bands, fireworks, and a reading of the Declaration of Independence, by a male, of course, a man named Richard Henry Lee. Immediately after Lee finished, suddenly and unexpectedly for sure, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and other leading suffragists of the time arose from their seats near the stage and marched up to the podium. Anthony whipped out a copy of a document they had created titled The Declaration of Rights of Women. Before the males in charge could drag them off the stage, Anthony delivered a brief statement about the document and read a portion of it. Getting back in control, the male organizers made sure the women were escorted away as another male started reading a poem he had written for the occasion. But, of course, the women were then able to mingle with the crowd and distribute the thousands of copies of the Declaration that they had brought with them. Lest you feel too sorry for the trials of the unappreciated women of the Women's Centennial Executive Committee, we'll next consider an even more unfairly downtrodden group, downtrodden even by the committee women. Very early on, the Centennial Women's Committee did not hesitate to enlist and organize Negro women across America in their efforts to raise money for the fair, and such women enthusiastically got on board with the efforts, until they realized that all work for the project was to be rigorously segregated. It also all too soon became obvious that there would be no mention or representation of the output of Negro women in any industry or arts in any displays in the Women's Building. And of course, it wasn't just black women. When black Americans, both men and women, first heard about the fair, there was anticipation that it would include opportunities for blacks to demonstrate their contribution to America's development. It wasn't long before all those hopes were proven fruitless. The only exhibit directly related to American blacks anywhere in the whole fair was a statue in the Memorial Hall Fine Arts Building titled The Abolition of Slavery in the United States. It depicted a freed slave holding the Emancipation Proclamation aloft as chains fell from his body. And not only was it not created by a black artist, it wasn't even created by an American artist. It was contributed by an artist from Italy. Blacks weren't even permitted to participate in the unskilled labor necessary for the construction of fair buildings or setup of the building displays. No black construction workers were employed, even though the unemployment rate for blacks in Philadelphia at the time was sky high at 70%. Once the fair was opened, the only employment for blacks was for menial jobs such as waiters, messengers, and janitors, or as entertainers. Entertainers? Yes, there was one place that hired black entertainers. It was the Southern Restaurant, a concession run by a white businessman from Atlanta, Georgia. The official fair guidebook informed you that you could eat your meal there entertained by a band of old-time plantation darkies who will sing their quaint melodies and strum the banjo before visitors of every clime. As Robert Rydell, well-known World's Fair researcher, wrote in his book All the World's a Fair, the impression created by the concession was that newly freed blacks in the South were happy, carefree, and in good hands. The harsh realities of sharecropping, lynching, and political exclusion were ignored. And to cap off the indignity of it all, the most famous black man in America at the time, former slave and powerful orator Frederick Douglass, had been invited to sit on the stage for opening ceremonies at the fair. But the fairground police refused to recognize his admission ticket to the stand, doubting that a person of his color had really been invited to sit among the elite white men. Only because one of the senators present, Roscoe Conkling of New York, recognized and vouched for him was he finally allowed to take a seat on the stage. It goes without question, though, of course, that he was not allowed to exercise his skill in oratory that day. And of course, blacks were not the only race persona non grata in their own land. Inside the fairgrounds, there were extensive displays, sadly but deliberately portraying Native Americans as primitive savages, their cultures as pitiful and worthless, and their future as one of imminent extinction at the hands of the highly evolved, civilized descendants of the Anglo-Saxon founders of the new nation. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington has sent a large collection of Indian artifacts for an ethnological display in the U.S. government building. Fairgoers were no doubt mostly inquisitive and amused by the carefully crafted portrayal of these allegedly inferior peoples. But it has to be admitted that right during the fair, a small instance of karma came. In early July, news arrived in Philadelphia, and no doubt buzzed around the fairgrounds, that on June 25th and 26th, at a Crow Indian reservation in southeastern Montana Territory, at a site along the Little Bighorn River, a temporary glitch occurred in the portrayal of the utter superiority of the Anglo-Saxon military might. Yes, that was the day George Armstrong Custer made his last stand, as did everyone else in his 7th Cavalry but one. That one's name was Comanche, and he was found severely injured on the battlefield 2 days later when other U.S. troops arrived and surveyed the devastating scene. He was nursed back to health, was retired from active duty, lived as an honored war hero for 15 more years, and died in 1891. You can still see Comanche if you'd like. Instead of burying his body, it was taxidermied and shipped to the University of Kansas, where you can still see him today in a display case at the university's Natural History Museum. Indian troubles were not the only troubles in the world outside the fairgrounds. 3 years before the start of the fair, in 1873, J. Cook and Company was the nation's premier investment bank. Unfortunately, in recent years, it had been making big bucks through overextending itself by offering risky loans to build railway systems across the land. Speculation on railroads was viewed by many in the early 1870s as the best get-rich-quick scheme going, leading to an excess of new railroads far beyond the transportation and freight movement needs of the time. On Thursday, October 18, 1873, its foolish, risky business all came crashing down on J. Cook and Company, and it declared bankruptcy. The news was officially announced at the New York Stock Exchange the next day, a day thereafter known as Black Friday, leading to an immediate panic by stockbrokers, which led to a collapse of the stock market. The news hit the papers and spread quickly across the nation, which led to an almost immediate beginning of a run on the banks. Thousands of businesses, both large and small, went bankrupt. 1 million workers were unemployed by 1874, with unemployment levels reaching 25% in some cities. This is an illustration of an unemployed workers demonstration in New York City in early 1874. 7,000 working-class people were gathered to demand the city set up a public works program to give work to the unemployed. 1,600 policemen were there to disperse them. Union movement leader Samuel Gompers later described what happened. Mounted police charged the crowd on 8th Street, riding them down and attacking men, women, and children without discrimination. It was an orgy of brutality. I was caught in the crowd on the street and barely saved my head from being cracked by jumping down a cellarway. And it wasn't long before the whole situation contributed to the collapse of economies around the world, triggering a global depression not rivaled again until the 1930s. In fact, until the 1930s, the term the Great Depression was used exclusively to refer to the situation that began on Black Friday in 1873. Yes, J. Cook and Company's collapse launched the first economic crisis of the industrial age. For over 5 years, the U.S. economy shrank, the longest such stretch in U.S. history. America's industrial base ground to a near halt. And by 1876, as the great success of American enterprise and industry was being celebrated inside the walls of the Centennial exhibition, outside, in the real world, half of the nation's railroads had declared bankruptcy, almost half of the country's iron furnaces were shut, and coal production collapsed. But enough of the gloom of 1876. It's almost time to move on from this historical World's Fair toward the next one. But before we do, I'll share one final behind-the-scenes detail about the fair. This is the Japanese garden from the 1876 Centennial as it looks today. The building was a gift to America from Japan in 1959, but the garden setting itself directly descended from the Japanese exhibition garden in place on the site in 1876. That garden was full of exotic plants that had never been seen in the U.S. before, including this pretty little ornamental plant. Many fair visitors took home samples of this plant from the fair and planted them in their yards. 8 years later, at the 1884 World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans, the Japanese once again had a pavilion, included this little plant in the garden there, and thus introduced it south of the Mason-Dixon line. There it caught on particularly as a front porch ornamental plant. By the early 1900s, it became recognized as a good ground cover plant to stop soil erosion and as a nutritious livestock feed. During the Dust Bowl years, the Civilian Conservation Corps planted more than 70 million seedlings in places such as this field in South Carolina. The government offered an incentive of $8 per acre to anyone willing to plant it on their property. The government even hired lobbyists to promote it. One of their most useful public advocates was gentleman farmer, author, and radio personality Channing Cope of Covington, Georgia. This is Channing with his young wife Ruth and his servants Susie and Will, broadcasting from his farm. He nicknamed the plant the Miracle Vine. Speaking of nicknames, Channing had earned a popular nickname of his own back in the day. It was the Kudzu Prophet. Yes, the pretty little plant introduced by the Japanese into the North American continent in 1876 was the kudzu vine. And I guess you could call it a miracle, all right. What other kind of plant could create this kind of magical, miraculous landscape? Why, it could even turn houses into scenery. Since at least the 1970s, kudzu has earned the nickname the plant that ate the South. It grows incredibly fast and covers and smothers everything in its path, blocking sunshine from reaching all that it has engulfed, much like a creature from some 1950s sci-fi movie. The Department of Agriculture quit recommending it as a ground cover in 1953, classified it as a weed in 1970, and placed it on the federal noxious weed list in 1993. It is now estimated to cover 7,400,000 acres of land in the southeastern United States. Battling the unwanted spread of kudzu has long been a real headache. Herbicides have been found ineffective as well as harmful to the environment. But there is one solution that has gained a lot of favor in recent years. Goats. Lots of goats. They love the stuff. And thus a whole service industry has arisen. Rent a goat. Yes, any individual and even whole cities can make arrangements to rent as many goats as you might need to come for a day or a week or more to trim back your kudzu. Unfortunately, kudzu has been found to be much hardier than at first thought, and has now been found in such places as New York City, Columbus, Ohio, and even Nova Scotia, Canada. This map from 2014 shows its range at that time. It is becoming a problem more slowly in northern climates, with cold killing the leaves but not destroying the roots. But eventually, it could, I suppose, become the plant that ate North America. If it does, it is weird to realize the situation could all be traced back to what seemed a simple, innocuous, pretty little Japanese display at the American Centennial Exposition in 1876. The fair, created to celebrate the 100th birthday of America the Beautiful, closed its doors for the final time on November 10, 1876. Most of the buildings, large and small, were soon either torn down or sold and moved. The Memorial Hall Art Building did remain, was turned into an art museum for the city of Philadelphia for a long time, and currently is home to the Please Touch Museum, a lively place mostly aimed at children 7 and under. The museum features a complete miniature model of the whole 1876 Centennial exhibition. Total admissions to the fair were about 10 million. A deadly heat wave in June and July hurt attendance, keeping it to 40,000 or less a day. 10 times during the heat wave, the temperature reached 100 degrees. Given the clothing styles at the time, it's amazing that even that many showed up to wander around in the hot sun and the unair-conditioned buildings. By September, temperatures were much cooler, and an amazing 250,000 people showed up for Pennsylvania Day on September 28th. Final receipts for the fair showed a profit of about $2 million for the initial investors. Unfortunately, after the fair closed, the U.S. government unilaterally decided to demand back a $1.5 million subsidy it had contributed to the fair construction. The commissioners had thought it had been an outright grant, but the government insisted it had been just a loan. After the loan was paid back, there wasn't even enough money left to pay for moving or demolishing all the buildings, leaving no profits for the investors. But as with every World's Fair, the final profit, from the point of view of most of those who attended, was no doubt the intangible value of the refreshing, exciting, and hopefully educational experience of the fair itself, which they no doubt would never forget, and tell their kids and grandkids about it for many years. Next up in this series of videos will be a visit to long remember to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893.